Hey, welcome to Living the Next Chapter. I have Frank Scalise on today. Frank is a retired police officer, detective. He has worked in almost every department in his area of the world. He comes as an author, and he's written multiple books, and he takes you behind the badge, behind the tape, police tape, and he shares his writings from a police officer's point of view. So instead of guessing at what life is like and how to create and draft a great series of books around what you think it's like to be a police officer, Frank has been there and he's done that, and he shares his knowledge with us here on Living the Next Chapter. It's great conversation, and I love talking to former and current police officers as they serve our community so well. And I just wanted to support Frank and thank Frank for being part of the podcast. Here we go. Living the Next Chapter, Frank Scalise. Ready? Here we go. Hey, welcome to the Living the Next Chapter podcast. I have another great guest with me. I have so many amazing guests come on. I'm so blessed to be able to talk to these great people. Frank is here with me today. Frank has served his community for many, many years in law enforcement. He has done so many great things in life, and he's here to talk about his author journey and all the great things that go along with that. And so, Frank, welcome to the podcast. So happy to have you here with me today.
Oh, thanks for asking. I appreciate it.
Like we mentioned when we chatted earlier, I grew up in a world where police officers were loved and respected. I had a gentleman who used to drive me to school in public school in police vehicles, and I always felt like the coolest kid in school rolling up in a SWAT van or whatever. And I've had one police officer in Ontario. He jokingly arrested me in front of all my friends at a party, but he set me up, and he was off duty, but he made it look like it was a real thing, and all my friends were freaking out. But I've had some really great police friends in the past, and I just want to thank you for all your service in your community, and to talk to somebody like you and the breadth of knowledge and wisdom you have. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So again, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Well, that's kind of you to say, and I'm really thrilled to be here.
Good. So tell me a little bit about your background and how long you served, and a little bit about your roles in law enforcement back in the day.
Well, I came to law enforcement at age 25. I was in the military before that for about 5 years. I was in military intelligence. I was a Czechoslovak linguist. And I came on the job back in 1993 in Spokane, Washington. So times were a little bit different. Of course, that's what the old grinders said when I came on, how times are different. Something old guys always say. And I had kind of an interesting career in that some of my friends and associates have had careers in which they did one or two positions and they just went super deep in that job and became, statewide, nationwide experts in it, that kind of thing. And there's a lot to be said for that degree of expertise. I never achieved that because I did a whole bunch of different things. So I always had enough experience to know what I was doing in each of these different categories, but certainly was not the best in my field in terms of knowledge because I wasn't there long enough. So I spent the first half of my career in patrol as a patrol officer, working all the different shifts, all the different parts of town. During that time period, I was a training officer as well. So the new recruits, when they come out of the academy, they ride with a series of training officers, and I was one of those. And then I got promoted to a rank called corporal, which is sort of an odd rank. They could never decide if it was a leadership role or if it was a technician role or some of both, and so it was a little bit of a messy position. But essentially, you're second to the sergeant on the squad in terms of leadership, and you also have the responsibility for photographs and evidence collection out in the field for those cases that don't rise to the level of calling out the forensic specialists. I guess 2001. So 8 years into my career, I got promoted to detective. I got to do that for a couple of years. I enjoyed detective quite a bit. In fact, at the time, becoming a homicide detective and having one of those deep dive careers was my intention. But a couple of years into my detective career, I did what we always did, what we were culturally prepped to do, and that is you take every promotional exam that comes along when you're eligible. And so I took the sergeant's exam, and I came out second on the list, which all but assured I was going to get promoted. So that was kind of a left turn into leadership roles, which I hadn't been planning or prepared for. And I became a sergeant about midway in my career. And so the second half of my career was a leadership trajectory. I was a sergeant, lieutenant, a captain. I was a major. Then they got rid of the major rank, so I was a captain again, and that's where I was when I retired. The nice thing about the leadership role, other than as a leader, you have the opportunity to really be of service to the people that you're leading. But on a very selfish note, the nice thing about it is I got to be in units as the unit commander that I was never in as an operator. So, for instance, I was the canine unit commander. I was never a canine handler. I always respected the handlers and thought they were cool and that the job was interesting. But I never had the opportunity to be a handler. As the unit commander, I got to be part of the unit, and I got to learn all about the canine unit, what the dogs do, how they work, what the handlers do, what they're looking for, what they need. And of course, a large part of gaining that knowledge was to be able to then represent the unit well with the department, make sure that they had the resources that they needed. But on a personal level, it was fascinating, and I really enjoyed it. And those guys were all great about sharing their knowledge and were very welcoming. Same thing happened with the SWAT team when I was selected as the SWAT commander. I was never a SWAT operator. And frankly, I wasn't in that kind of shape. Yeah. And I got to learn about the tactics and the equipment and the strategies of the team and to partake in the training. And from everything from firearms training to rappelling to you name it. And all of that at an individual level it was great because it was things that were very interesting to me, and I really enjoyed it. And as a leader, obviously, it was an important role to make sure that these groups ran smoothly and that they had all the resources that they needed. Eventually, as the patrol captain, or as the captain, I was in charge of all of patrol at one time, all of investigations at another time, all of operations when I was a major. And that level of leadership becomes a little more political. And I won't say I enjoyed that. I mean, I think it was some valuable lessons and life experience there. But everybody dislikes politics for a reason.
Yeah.
And so I think as a leader, some of the best time I had was being a unit commander and getting to be part of a team. And that was a lot of fun. But that was essentially my career, was get experience at the operator level and then get experience in the leadership roles. And I did that for 20 years.
Wow. It's amazing. I'm so amazed with the career and the breadth of the things that you can do within serving your community. Like there's not just one avenue that you go down and you do that for the rest of your career. You get the ability to branch out and help in different areas. That's amazing. So tell me about your author story. Where does all this play into your career? And at what point did you wake up on a Monday morning and go, I'm going to be an author. I'm going to write a book. Like, how does that happen?
I was about 10 years old, I guess.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember waking up on any particular day. I guess, I know you're a musician. Yeah. And I suspect you've always felt like you were a musician, and you've always been a musician. It just is who you are. And that's a really good analogy for what writing has been to me.
Okay.
It was storytelling first. It was being a little liar before that. I had a problem with telling stories when I was 5 or 6 years old. But becoming a storyteller evolved into becoming a writer. by the time I was 10, 11, 12, 13, it was pretty well cemented in my identity.
Nice.
And so, but I mean, even less so, I think, than a musician. As a writer, you don't just like hang out your sign and people start sending you checks because you declare yourself a writer. So that's why I knew I was probably going to have to do some other career along the way, and then that's where I went into the military and went on to the job. I had a good 10-year gap where I came on the job. I was still writing a fair amount for about 2 or 3 years, but I was learning so much new stuff, so many new skills and everything on the job. And then, I became a training officer and I had to learn how to do that. And then I became a corporal and I had to learn how to do that. And so I was constantly learning a new job. And then in 96, I also went back to college and got my undergraduate degree in history. So for about 2.5 years there, I was going to school full time while I was working full time. So I was writing a lot, but it was police reports and history papers, right? And so not a lot of fiction came out from about 95 to about 2004. And then finally, I was done with college. I thought I was going to go back and get my master's about a year after I graduated in 98. I didn't go back until 2012. So the myth of the gap year was a gap decade almost, or more than. But I was done with my undergraduate degree. I'd settled into a position as a sergeant where I kind of had a desk job for a couple of years working with the volunteers. So it was a day gig, kind of flexible. And suddenly I had time in my life to write again. And right about that same time, another officer that I met that I became friends with, who is now my co-author, Colin Conway, we met and started talking, and we're both super excited about getting back into a writing because he had a similar thing where he hadn't done much writing over the past number of years. And we started encouraging each other and swapping stories and, giving each other feedback and everything. And just like anything else, when you have an interest and someone else has that same interest, and then you kind of feed off of it and encourage each other, it, accelerates that interest quite a bit. And so about 2004, I started writing pretty steadily again. And what came out at that point was crime fiction, because that was what I was living. So the majority of what I've written since then, probably 80%, has been some kind of crime fiction, whether it's police procedural or private detective or hard boiled or whatever.
What would you say your mix is on a typical book that you've written between fact and fiction? How do you kind of blend that?
Well, I would say it's all 100% fiction. Okay. What isn't fictional, I guess, are the small details. How things are done, how people view things, or how some people view things in the field, and things like this. So the color and the texture and the nuance of the job is very realistic, especially in the procedural series, the River City series or the Charlie 316 series. But I've been pretty careful. I'd say 99.8% of what I've written is completely fictional.
Okay. So let's steal a term. Well, I just said a word, steal. Let's borrow a term from, I don't get in trouble, borrow a term from policing. And how do you pursue a story? The pursuit of a story is really interesting to me. How does this all kind of come to play with you? I'm kind of picturing you flicking on your lights in the car and taking off after a story. Take me down the path of how this actually starts for you.
That's a pretty cool image.
You like that? Yeah.
I might have to borrow that myself.
There you go.
That's never been a problem for me. They chase me more than I chase them, to be honest with you.
Nice.
But usually what ends up happening is either a character will come to mind that is very interesting, and I'll ask the question, who's this person about? What kind of, situations will they get into? Or even more often than that, a what if sort of scenario comes to mind. What if, what if somebody wanted to do this? I mean, I wrote a story 15 years ago, called Rescuing Isaac. And the question that prompted that story was, I was driving home from work one day and I looked over at the jail and there was a whole bunch of work being done on it. And I started thinking about how, that's probably a security, nightmare for the people that work there. And the question came, well, what if somebody wanted to break out of a jail today? I mean, it's not like the cowboy days, where you just throw a rope through the bars and hit the horse and, and or whatever. And then of course the follow-up question was, well, why would they want to? What would be important enough to break out of jail? Jail is prison, jail is more or less temporary for most of its inhabitants. They're waiting for trial, or they're there, just having been arrested briefly. Some people do serve their term there, but nobody serves, you can't serve more than a year at the jail. So, breaking out of jail is a pretty big deal. So why would you do it? And the story that came out of that was the answer to that question. If I'm really fortunate, then a character that I'm thinking about and a situation that I'm thinking about coalesce into one. And that tends to be the most fruitful stories that come out of that.
How do you think that writing helped you with the stresses of being a police officer and serving your community? I hear a lot from police officer friends and family where officers will go after different things to kind of deal with the stresses of work. How did writing help you cope and thrive in your job?
I think in a couple of ways. I mean, for one, because it was such a integral part of my personality and my identity and everything, making progress in that area, was positive for me. It made me feel good about myself or about my life. And so that's certainly a good thing. But as far as stress relief goes, you're absolutely right. It gave me something to focus on that wasn't the job. And of course I was writing about crime fiction. So, you could call it a little bit of a busman's holiday, perhaps. But I think in the early going, especially, there are some elements of, I wouldn't call it exactly wish fulfillment in some of the stories, but maybe, you could get away with calling it that, things that, man, I would have really loved to pop off with this line, to a suspect, but I really don't want to get a complaint. So I bit my tongue. In the story, in this book I'm writing, hey, this suspect's a jerk. That's a line I can use. And so one of these fictional characters pops off, and guess what? They don't get a complaint because I get to have some control over that. So I think that occurred once in a while, but mostly it was about something that I loved, that I felt like I was progressing and I could focus on it. And I think that helps bleed away the stress. I think a lot of stress from any stressful job or career can come from focusing on it, constantly and just obsessing on it constantly. And so however you divert your attention, even if it's to, a parallel sort of thing, which writing crime fiction is sort of parallel to being involved in law enforcement, it still has that impact.
What about some feedback from your readers and people that have picked up your books over the years? Anything kind of stand out to you when you've heard back from somebody and they've made comments about your writing, and how that kind of encouraged or challenged you to hear back from them?
I'd say that it's always great when you create any sort of art that somebody gets it and likes it. That feedback is always pleasant. I think the feedback that I paid attention to was that people liked the gritty realism of the stories, whether it was a procedural or a hard-boiled story or book. They liked that it wasn't Hollywood. It wasn't, the same thing they were getting on TV every week at 9 p.m. on a Friday, on this show here, or, what we're seeing in the movies. It was a little more realistic. And that was what I was striving for. So that was good feedback to get. That's the one that's really, I think, reinforced itself throughout my career, to the point where eventually my tagline became, Frank Zafiro writes gritty crime fiction from both sides of the badge. Well, that's part of the reason why I chose that, is that feedback.
What's your age group for your books? Do you have a certain span that you're writing towards? Like, is it somebody younger can read, or what do you kind of focus on?
I'd say most of the crime fiction is adult.
Okay.
To use the U.S. rating systems, certainly PG-13 to R, depending on what element we're talking about. I used to use more profanity when I was younger. I've gotten a little more circumspect about it now, so that it has more impact. The violence is certainly, it's crime fiction, so I haven't shied away from that. I haven't written a lot of sex in my books, so I mean, the few times I guess I have, that would be an R rating, but mostly it'd probably be PG for sexual content. But definitely, I don't usually point to anybody younger than 16 or 17 towards most of my books, just because it's adult content. It's mature content. And I think adults can read it and they can put it into context and they can understand that it's fiction, and a 14-year-old might not be as equipped to do that, depending on the kid. So I wrote some kids' books for those kids. So
yeah, there you go.
Crime fiction,
different thing. Yeah. So the nice thing I love about all this, Frank, though, is you're not somebody guessing at what it's like to be a police officer. You're not guessing what it's like to walk, across that crossed off tape on a crime scene. You are the guy that has done this. So you have just built into you knowledge about the process, which no one can replicate. And that's what I love, is if you want something realistic and something that you can really dive into, what you're writing about is coming from a realistic place that people can really identify with. That's a unique superpower, I would think, for you in writing your books.
The funny thing about it is that, I retired in 2013, so we're talking 9 years now.
Yeah.
And so that's becoming more and more an historical fact, and maybe not necessarily quite as much a current fact. Like, I have to double check if I'm writing something that's going on today. I have to sometimes double check that they didn't discontinue that particular process, or this law hasn't changed. If I get down into that nitty gritty. Thankfully, my River City series is only up to 2010 now, so I'm still within my career time period, historically. But things change. I mean, certainly a decade is a long time in a career field, as quickly changing as law enforcement.
So talk about your most recent book that you worked on. Let us know a little bit more about that as well.
The most recent River City book that I worked on is called The Worst Kind of Truth. It features a detective, Detective Katie McLeod. And Katie has been a series mainstay since the first book. She was kind of a secondary character in the first couple of books, and then kind of rose to the first among equals by the time the third book came out. And she's been the core of the series ever since. Worst Kind of Truth is book 11. So she's been a big part of the series. And she's progressed from, 3-year police officer, so barely past being a rookie, to, a detective who has some experience. And so there's a reason to read them in order right there, if anybody's wondering. But they can all be read independently as well. In The Worst Kind of Truth, Katie catches a couple of cases. The first one is a stranger-to-stranger rape, a sexual assault of a prostitute. And, she has an unknown suspect, so she's got a lot of work cut out for her. While she's working that case, she gets another sexual assault. This one is more of a what you would call a date rape situation, or a he said, she said scenario, where there's really no question that the act took place. It was just the context and how it took place, and there's not a lot of independent evidence one way or the other. So it's a tough case. And she has to, try to pick her way through that as well. And this is complicated by the fact that she was a victim herself years ago. And so, she's got that to deal with at the same time. She has to balance her knowledge as a law enforcement officer on this subject with the public perception of the subject matter as well, because it's a very delicate subject. I mean, it's a lot different than getting your car stolen or even your home broken into. Those are both property crimes. And while certainly a burglary is very invasive, it's nowhere near the same thing as a physical assault and then a sexual assault, which is even more invasive, obviously.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit then about just kind of where you're heading with your writing as well. Like, what's down the road for you? Is there something new that's exciting for you that you're working on?
Well, I've got like 8 series, and about 6 of them are still open, or 5 of them. I'd have to go double check now. Wow. And so part of what I'm doing is I'm taking each of those series to, the 3rd book or the 6th book, a good stopping or resting point, and to close some arcs, some story arcs or character arcs and things of that nature. River City, I'm on, I just did number 11. I'll continue to do that. It's kind of my perennial series that I don't think I'll ever stop writing. Certainly not for another 8 or 10 books at least. And so that's most of what I'm doing, is continuing in the crime fiction mold. But it's kind of fun as as a musician, you like to stretch different genres of music, different instruments, if you have that kind of talent. And so I've written some non-crime fiction stuff in the last year. Wrote sort of a literary piece called A Village of Strangers. And then one I really enjoyed, just this summer, I published a book called A Baker's Divorce, which is a humor, I guess it's more of a dramedy or a comedy drama about a guy named Cal Baker, who's an aging rocker who had a big hit back in like 79. And he's been clinging to status as a rock and roll C-lister ever since then, by chasing every trend that comes along, usually a few years late. I mean, he had a disco album in disco record in 1985, so I mean, he's kind of late, behind the 8 ball a little bit. And along the way, he's been married and divorced a dozen times, 12 times. And at the beginning of the book, no spoilers here, his current wife, number 13, tells him, "I want a divorce." And so that sends him on a kind of a vision quest to figure out, why does this keep happening to me? Which that very question probably indicates to the more astute listener what the issue is with Cal. But he goes on a little bit of a self-discovery mission, and given that he's kind of set in his ways and he's kind of been pampered to a degree, and he's in his 60s now, so old habits die hard. It ends up causing a few, I think, funny situations, and I had a lot of fun with it. And I actually didn't intend it to be very serious. I wanted it to be funny the whole way through. And then I kind of, like what happens with these stories sometimes, is I discovered what the story really was, and so it takes a little bit more of a bittersweet or heartstring tugging sort of tone towards the end. But for the most part, it's just humor, and that's something completely different from crime fiction. I mean, I've written funny scenes occasionally, more frequently a funny exchange or a line or two. And I knew I could do funny in short bursts, but I didn't know if I could manage it over the course of even a short book. Yeah. And I mean, I'll let the readers decide if I have, but the feedback I've gotten across the boards has been pretty good on it. So that's called A Baker's Divorce. Cal Baker getting, hopefully not his baker's dozen of divorces.
So that's great. So the other part of this, on top of everything else, when you have time, you've kind of squeezed in a podcast as well. Wrong place, right time, with the word right as in author writing. That's a podcast that you've had for years, and you're thinking maybe of shelving it or keeping it going. You're kind of going back and forth. We'll put links to this in the podcast so people can go listen. But podcasting and being an author, is that a great combination for you think?
Yeah, it really was. Wrong Place, Right Crime is my wife came up with that. I give proper credit where credit is due.
Well done.
It was a podcast that focused on crime fiction authors, and my goal was to put the spotlight on some of my friends, people I admired, and then eventually people I'd never heard of before that were seeking out the podcast, and sometimes had written one book, sometimes had been around for a while, and it gave me the opportunity to really push other authors and really give back to the community in that way. And then, of course, you get to make that connection too, and that's kind of nice to connect with a peer. And so I had a lot of fun doing it. I started in 2017, 166 episodes later,
Wow.
2022. June, I put it on hiatus. Like you said, I haven't decided entirely how long that hiatus will be, but nice thing about podcasts, as you well know, is they're evergreen.
Yeah.
So people can discover a 2018 interview with whoever, tomorrow, and still, discover their next favorite writer, even though, I'm not putting out any new episodes at the moment.
Awesome. Well, thank you. We'll put links to all this in the show notes. How else, Frank, can people be in contact with you? And I know your books are widely available. So what is the best way to be in touch with you? Where are you most active?
Well, certainly my website is a good place to start. That's frankzafiro.com. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, although that's a bit of a mess at the moment, I guess.
Yeah.
And Instagram, which I think I'm half a generation too old for to really to use properly.
Yeah.
But those are the places I tend to be the most. I'm also on BookBub if people want to follow me there. And I have a newsletter that I share information either exclusively or first to the newsletter folks, and free stuff on occasion. And that's a good way to keep up with me as well. And I don't spam people's mailboxes. It's, maybe once a month.
Yeah. Nice. Excellent, Frank. It's so great to talk to you. And again, growing up the way I have and having great examples in my life of people serving their community, just like yourself, I just feel honored to have time with you. And again, to be able to be another person to say thank you for your service. I really do appreciate a life of people who run towards trouble where people are running from it. And I love the fact that you've created this world for yourself in being an author, and that you can reach so many people now with a pen and a piece of paper. You can reach out and touch people. So thank you for doing what you do. And again, thank you for being part of the podcast. It's really great to meet you and talk to you today.
Well, you as well. Those are very kind words, and they are very much appreciated.
Awesome. Everyone, please go check out Frank's links in the show notes. And again, I'd love to talk to you again in the future, Frank. And if the podcast comes back up to life again, please let me know, and we will have links as well to your podcast and all your great stuff. Thanks, Frank. Well, the podcast is over. Thank you for being a part of this episode. If this is your very first episode, welcome to Living the Next Chapter. You can go back in our catalog. You can see some of the past episodes. But if you want to get a sneak peek of what's coming, you want to jump the line? I got something for you. Go to our YouTube channel. Again, links are in the show notes and on our website, livingthenextchapter.com, and you can go to our YouTube channel and get the most recent episode way before everybody else. So we're putting this at the end of the podcast because we don't want to tell everyone. We don't want to have a stampede, But we're having some great conversations over on our YouTube channel. You're invited. You've been here this far. You're the one listening. You are invited to our YouTube channel. Go over there and you can see the most up-to-date episodes in real time. Meet you over there. Thanks for listening. Cheers.
Mindshift Power Podcast, the podcast for teenagers and those who work with them. There's a huge problem in America today. There's a very large disconnect between teenagers and the adults who work with them. I'm looking to bridge that gap with real, raw, honest conversation, not held back by the chains of political correctness. You cannot solve a problem you do not understand. Want to understand teenagers today? Listen to this podcast. This podcast is for teens in the U.S. and Canada. To learn more, go to fatimabay.com/podcast or just look for Mindshift Power Podcast on any listening platform. I look forward to you being a faithful listener.